morning, Franklin. Thank you for joining me. Can you introduce yourself to the Informs membership?
Yeah, so I'm a professor in the Department of Anesthesia at the University of Iowa. And I went to medical school and got my PhD in engineering at Case Western. And then I did my anesthesiology residency at Iowa, and I've always been there. And ever since the mid 90s, we set up in the Department of Anesthesia, there's a division of management consulting, and I'm formally the director, but basically it's me.
Great. And how long have you been an Informs member?
I was able to figure it out pretty easily. I wrote it down. 1998 is
Great.
when I started. Yep.
Long time member.
Well, it's been a long time that I've been, doing these things and stuff like that. It's amazing where I write papers, and now it's, I did the math like 23 years ago or 25 years ago.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into this field?
Yeah, so when I was interested in math applied to medicine, even from high school and when I was applying to colleges. So in colleges, I take applied mathematics courses, statistics courses, biology courses, and so forth. And when I got to graduate school, what I wanted to do was take courses in pretty much everything or anything that was applied. And it didn't really matter what area as long as it seemed practical. So a lot of the courses I took were in discrete event simulation and optimization, things like that. And then after my anesthesiology residency, what I did was people began asking me questions about operating room management. And, I found when I answered their questions, they'd say thank you and give me more projects to work on. So the first one that happened was I was finishing my anesthesiology residency, and people were saying that my patients, basically when they were in the recovery room, that was costing money. And I'd look around and say, well, if the nurses are there, but it happens to be early in the day and the recovery room's empty, it's not costing a thing. I mean, because the people are there. So it would be like if the restaurant's empty and there's all the, waitresses and waiters are there. If you stay longer at the table as a customer, it's not costing anything more. So, and that was the first project, and people found it interesting and said, here's another project. And it just kept on growing. So it was applying what I had learned in graduate school, just not exactly what I was expecting I'd apply from graduate school.
Right. So your degree is in biomedical engineering, correct?
Yeah, well, yes. Okay, so the degree says biomedical engineering, but it's not biomedical engineering. So when I applied for the MD PhD programs, I knew biostatistics back in the 80s was very much clinical trials. And that in retrospect, it probably would have been very interesting, but at the time, that wasn't kind of what I was interested in. And in the same way, epidemiology was very much classical epidemiology. And I liked what now we would call analytics, but I hadn't even heard the term analytics for even at most 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So in retrospect, what I've been doing is analytics for many decades. So I had to apply to biomedical engineering programs because that was the only way to be able to do it back then. So, but I would say you can think of it as analytics. The analytics programs is what I would do now. So like in college, what I worked on was projects. There was a parameter estimation for partial differential equations in 2 dimensions, spatial and time. So it's really not, quote, engineering by what most people would think of. We call it, industrial engineering or analytics, something like that. And Case Western didn't have an industrial engineering department.
Gotcha. Can you talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected your last year, either professionally or otherwise?
Well, it's affected it a lot. I mean, my department is anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists, and I really think our department did very well in terms of managing the pandemic and the transition. What had happened was that for several years, I've been collaborating with Dr. Randy Loftus. He's in my department, and he developed techniques to measure the transmission of pathogenic bacteria in operating rooms. And the idea is that it's a marker for basically causes of infection. And my role has been in the mathematics of how operating room case scheduling affects how you plan study design. And specifically that surgical cases are not randomly assigned to operating rooms. Some operating rooms are used for orthopedic surgery, other operating rooms for heart surgery, and so forth. So when the pandemic began, we had a paper in press that was embargoed in JAMA Open, and it was about how to use operating room management and how to change your cleaning processes in operating rooms to reduce the spread of infection, the transmission of infection in operating rooms. And so when the pandemic started, we very quickly got financial support to extend the work to SARS-CoV-2, the virus causing COVID-19. So the result is that so far I've taken only 4 hours of vacation since the pandemic started. But next month, I'm planning on taking a lot of vacation. And really some of that work is sort of really coming to fruition now. So that's been the major change. I think that for just like a lot of other people, it informs my teaching. It's about a quarter of my job. That completely changed. I don't teach undergrads. Most of the people who take my courses are in their 30s through 60s. And basically they come together in small teams to solve math word problems that relate to operating rooms. And now that I've revised the course and done remotely by Zoom, I'm kind of expecting that I'll never do it in person again, which I kind of think I'm going to miss in some ways. But it's very nice having people around the world. That's been the big change. And I think that's very nice as well. There are advantages and disadvantages.
Agreed. So you mentioned that paper that you were publishing prior to the pandemic, and you've published nearly 600 academic papers when I was looking at your CV in a handful of different scholarly journals, including a few Informs journals. Can you tell us any research you're working on now that you'd like looking to get published?
Yeah, so the thing is that practically speaking, I think by most standards in terms of operations, research and management science and stuff, I'm an industry. I mean, I work for my department in the hospital, and the projects that I do are things that get assigned, the vast majority of them. And typically, yeah, when I would publish in Informed journals, it would be work with other people are doing, and I'm sort of the domain expert. They kind of want advice from somebody in industry. That's kind of basically what I do.
So sorry to interrupt, do you have any sort of research quotas like an academic might that you must publish a certain number of times, or?
I mean, I think that probably people would get really disappointed if I, stop, publishing. Well, no, I would say that probably people would probably not care if I stopped publishing. They want me to solve the problems in the department. But the thing is that I don't think without publishing that I'd be able to get my work done. And the reason I say that is that for most problems that we deal with, we need to get data deals with other places. So I'll kind of give an example. So one of the questions that people are interested in is that I need to solve is the probability distributions of the times that patients remain in recovery rooms, conditional on the time so far. So our idea is not to basically say from the time the person first arrives in the recovery room, we're going to change what we do, but we're going to wait and see how they do and then selectively intervene. Now, in order to do that project, though, we don't have all the data that we need, okay? We basically have been working with a hospital in Japan. And what's important about that hospital, like most hospitals in Japan, patients don't go to recovery rooms after surgery. They stay in the operating room. Mm-hmm. So my ability to work with the colleagues in Japan, that depends on our publishing. So we're using publishing as a way to work with other people. Then another project involves the spatial and the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in operating rooms. And when the pandemic began, one of the questions that I had to answer is, where is the virus going to be found in operating rooms? Where will you expect it to be? And what I was able to do by publishing was contacting investigators in a company. And I knew that that company had done study with submolecular, submicron particles in operating rooms. And kind of basically sort of the deal is, we're going to be publishing, which is good for them. But in the same way, then we have access to the data. So these are examples where to solve the problems in my department, we work with others. Another topic, for example, which the department's been very concerned about is in the operating room, anesthesiologists work by supervising either trainees, anesthesia residents, or nurse anesthetists. And most hospitals in the United States is nurse anesthetists. And so for each patient, the anesthesiologist would typically supervise, let's say, 3 nurse anesthetists. Sometimes it's fewer, sometimes it can be as many as 4. And that affects productivity and labor costs. So in trying to understand how if you're trying to monitor the ratio in terms of nurse anesthetists to anesthesiologists and how that will affect related to productivity, when you take into account long-term decisions, collaborating with experts who are particularly good in terms of the tools of monitoring these ratios, that really depends on publishing. And so one of the people with whom I've been working, he's at the University of Texas in Galveston, Abalesh, and he's an expert. I think that without publishing, it would be very hard to get the time and the motivation and interests of colleagues at other places. So I think addressing the question again, I think that publishing is a necessary step to solve my department's and the university problems. But I don't think that there's any measure in terms of saying, great work, Frank, based on the publishing.
Gotcha. Thank you. So as you know, Informs publishes, we have 17 journals now. Which Informs journal have you found particularly useful in your line of work?
Well, I think that the one that's had the biggest effect, remarkably, has been Transportation Science one. And so when I would go to the Informs meetings, a lot of it has been trying to understand over many years, thinking to myself, there's got to be a relationship between the airline industry and operating rooms. And, but there isn't. One of the big things, for example, in the airplanes is that they also have, a lot of times flights are delayed, and in the operating rooms, surgical cases take longer than expected. But for the airplanes, they take off, and once they have their wheels up, they'll say we're going to land in 13 hours and 27 minutes, and we land in 13 hours 27 minutes. For surgery, the variability is in flight. There's really very little variability in terms of when your plane would take off or something like that. It's in flight is the source of the variability. And it's not like you want the surgeon, for example, to speed up if it's difficult. That's counterproductive. So, and in the same way, we used to think okay, so railroads, there's got to be a relationship in some way. But, there really probably isn't so much, all that much. But there are consequences. So we've been doing work, for example, one topic of concern to my department is for anesthesiologists who've recently had babies and they're lactating, is that if you need to have a breast milk pumping session, that how does another anesthesiologist relieve you if you're supervising you multiple responsibilities, supervising multiple operating rooms? And it's not just having a person to do it, it's to have the timing for all the tasks to be right. And so I think about how that would relate to, let's say, a long-haul bus driver, for example, where you can't, for example, stop in the middle of the highway to switch from one bus driver to another. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of relationship to transportation. And so I kind of am always looking for transportation articles, thinking about which apply and which don't apply.
Great. Research or anything fun, what have you learned in the last month that you want to share?
Well, I always I read a lot of papers, which I like. And so there was one that was really helpful. I think it's kind of really useful. So Lev Sager, he's in Germany, and he works with people at the Cleveland Clinic. And they do lots of observational studies, do very good statistics. And they had a paper in which what they did is they have more than 100 anesthesiologists and more than 100 nurse anesthetists. And they had a great idea. They're very good at the Cleveland Clinic at tracking how the patients do long-term, which is wonderful. And so they broke up all the patients by subspecialty. And then they took the nurse anesthetists by how often they work with each subspecialty. And for every subspecialty, they ranked them from doing the fewest number of cases to the most. And they broke them up into quartiles. And then they did the same thing for the anesthesiologists. So they looked, first of all, at if you have both the nurse anesthetist and the anesthesiologist, and they're in the upper quartile, it happened to be for that subspecialty in terms of the number of cases. And they compared it to if both were the lower quartile. And, sure enough, you'd expect that there would be more complications if you have both of them in the lower quartile. And that was to be kind of expected. And the problem is, it's not that means it's best to change necessarily, because you still have to work with the people you have. But what was so striking is that the difference is very large. It's the magnitude that's important. So when both were in the lower quartile of cases, the complication rate of things like heart attacks and strokes, major complications, was 12%. And when both are in the upper quartile, it's 7%. I mean, it's a 5% difference in the absolute rate, not the relative rate, the absolute rate. So it's very large. And the other thing which is so striking to me, because of the work we do in infections, is that the difference is infections. And the role that anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists play in somehow by their activities influencing infections, I think is a very important thing for my field in the future. And we as a field just, I think, have poor understanding of exactly what people do that causes these greater infections that you see in observational studies. So I think it's a very thought-provoking study in epidemiology and very good work. So I keep on thinking about the study and what to make of it.
What interest do you have outside of work and research that might surprise someone you know?
Well, I think I'm pretty, for the people who I know well, I think I'm pretty limited in my scope. I basically kind of work a lot, and I really am impressed that you can watch entire episodes of seasons of TV shows. So I ride an exercise bike, and to me, you can watch 10 shows in a row. It's remarkable. But for people who kind of work with me, I live in Amherst, New York. I don't live in Iowa City. So my wife was recruited to Roswell Park, which is one of the cancer hospitals in the United States. And so actually right now I'm in Amherst, New York. And then I go back about once a month to Iowa City.
Oh, when did that happen? When did you move?
We've lived here now for 10 years.
Oh, great. Wow. So that wasn't recent.
I teach, up until the pandemic, I was traveling 80% time for work. And I would travel around the country going to different hospitals and teaching basically the same course again and again. And I'm kind of expecting that probably is gone. I suspect forever. I don't think for what I do, people are going to have me travel, much if at all.
Great. You mentioned binge watching some shows when you ride a bike. What's your favorite binge watch?
So I rewatched the season, The Americans, the one on FX about the spies and stuff like that in Washington. Yeah, so I like stories that involve some sort of intersection of families and also doing things.
Action
that is somewhat plausible. So I found it to be really, I liked rewatching it.
Cool. Any advice you would give to your younger self?
Well, I think that, one of the things is, for example, that, my wife and I live in Amherst, New York. And so I think that we found it very hard in terms of career decisions when we were younger. And I think that in the end, the decisions we made, which have resulted in our, spending more time together, just to be confident in them. Everything has worked out just fine, but we sure were worried about it when we were younger, and it wasn't worth worrying about.
Yeah, stress less, maybe. If you could safely travel anywhere in the world right now, where would you go?
Yeah, I know it's kind of boring, but I really want to go to Akron, Ohio. It's where my mother-in-law is, and she's 92.
Mm.
So I'd really like to see her and my wife's family. And my parents are younger. They're in New Hampshire. So to go see my parents. So I'm going to start with seeing parents and move on from there.
So it has been a rough year, but is there anything about 2020 that you hope remains in the future? Any positive outcomes?
Well, I know that different people who teach in different ways, there must be ups and downs. I found I teach basically small teams how to solve math problems. And usually teams involve, an anesthesiologist who might have a background in, maybe they're an engineer as an undergraduate. There are a lot of them. Very often there's, somebody who's like a hospital financial analyst and managers. And teaching by Zoom, people do really well working in small teams. I mean, there's disadvantages because there are fewer people that I can handle, but people can be from around the world. And so I think that trying to continue for, I would say, postgraduate education remotely would be very good. And in the same way, I really love the idea of, people getting together professionally from around the world. But I know that for what I do, the yield during the pandemic seems to be really good by Zoom. So I hope that people continue, at least for working in hospitals, to take advantage of this idea of doing things globally. I've been seeing that for more and more now, the hospitals are having visiting professors who are from around the world, where the expense would be very large. And now it's very easy to have something which is very early in the morning, at a hospital, and is maybe kind of later in the afternoon in Europe. It works wonderfully.
Yeah.
So I really hope that that continues. I know that I'm not talking about like the young kids where, not being in the classroom is such a problem.
Yeah.
But I think that by the time you're like 50 or something like that, it works really well.
Great. Well, thank you for your time today. Enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.